to go. Alessandra, all yours.
Thank you so much, Marcella. Thank you for having me here today. I'm very happy to be here talking about my research and the lab's research too. So, just to give you a little bit of context before I start, so I'm Brazilian, as you have already probably observed by my accent. I was raised and born in Brazil and also trained in Brazil. My PhD is International Relations from a Brazilian university. And I have been working in these two projects, the Data Plus Feminism Lab, which is situated at MIT, led by Catherine D'Ignazio, who wrote Data Feminism, and in which is also part of the Data Against Feminicide initiative. These initiatives, like the huge project, transnational project led by people in the US, like Catherine, in the UK, in Argentina, in Uruguay, and is a project that aims to support activists, people, so civil society organizations that collect data about feminicides. Feminicides are the gender-related killings if you already know, right? So the project aims to research these activists, but also to support them through two ways. The first of them by developing technology, and the second of them by creating a community of practice, by putting activists together and make them dialogue in some sense to develop and share strategies, ideas, concepts, and so on. So this piece, this text I will present to you today, the missing data text book chapter actually was developed in the context of these two projects I'm part of. Before I start, I would be very glad if you could share a little bit about yourselves in the chat, right? I know there are some people from Brazil here too. It would be very nice if you could share and use the chat a little bit to share our thoughts. Maybe you can think yourselves about missing data situations, and I will ask you about that in the end after I present the concept. So feel free to share. Just to talk a little bit about this chapter. So in 2022, the Data Society Research Institution opened this call about the keywords in relation to the state, in relation to data and the state. And then Catherine D'Ignazio, Lauren Klein, and we sent an abstract, which later was transformed in this chapter called Missing Data, and it's open access. I created this tiny URL link you can access, Missing Data 1. So the whole book is actually very interesting. The keywords of the data state is the name of the book, is open access. Each chapter is a different keyword, like counter data production, data in relation to the public sphere, and so on. Indigenous data sovereignty, that we're going to be talking about this later today. We try to in this chapter to conceptualize missing data in one sense and also to bring examples to bring a lot of examples to explain what it is, and I'll pass through it now in this presentation. So before I start, let me provide you a little bit of a context on why you are doing what you are doing in this chapter. So maybe some of you already know that, maybe others don't. Like, I'm a social scientist, not a data scientist or an engineer by training. So I know a lot of my colleagues in social science don't have a lot of contact with data science per se. But if you search the concept, if you search missing data in any searching platform nowadays, like Google, you find a lot of explanations about missing data that don't reflect the political and social science relationship perspective we think about in this chapter. It's very different from the perspective we adopt here. In STEM fields, like missing data is typically more understood as in statistic terms. Something is missing in a row of an Excel, for example. The data is literally absence. There are rows, there are columns in which values are missing. So the emphasis here is much more identifying gaps and filling these gaps in a data set than treating missing data as you do this as a political perspective, through a political perspective, right? So it's it's more understood in a traditional sense, as a technical problem than a political one. So this is the conventional approach. And in our view, something is missing when you think about missing data in that sense. So what is lost, you ask, when you understood missing data merely as a technical glitch, rather than that's something that's also political. So for us, there are political reasons why data doesn't exist. These are power dynamic related to power dynamics between those who collect the data and those who are counted, or those who want to be counted and are not, or those who want to protect the data about themselves and cannot because the state or powerful institutions make sure to have this data. So missing data for us, it reflects this intentionality shaped by these dynamics between different groups. And here we're thinking especially about the state, right? The relation of the government, of the state with civil society organizations and individuals, for example. So, and this is very clear also in Data Feminism. If you already had read this book by Catherine and Lauren, they understand data collection as data and data production and big data sets as never neutral. And we came from this premise too in these books. So missing data for us is a political concept. We go a little bit further and to further contextualize the idea of missing data as you think about here, we draw a lot of inspiration also in the intervention of Mimi Onuoha, which the perspective on missing data sets and missing data is very different too. When she has this intervention called the Library of Missing Data Sets that you can see in her website, she's thinking about like the data sets that don't exist at all. And then she make like this concrete material intervention in showing all the data sets that don't exist, but in her words, they should exist. So there is an expectation. An example she brings, we cannot see here because it's too small, maybe. But the example she gives is like the public unavailable data about gun violence, for example. Data on people excluded from public housing because of their criminal records. Data on trans people killed or injured in incidents of hate crimes. All these data sets that are missing, but in which her perspective, they should exist. The thing in how we work in our chapter is to understand how this is going on in this relationship among civil society and the state. Who is asking for data? Who is producing data in relation to missing data situations? And is how I go like to explain these concepts. These concepts based also in many examples that exist in reality. So before I go on the concept of missing data itself, I'd like to talk, maybe many of you, maybe not, but just to explain so everybody's in the same, with the same line, on the same ground, right? The concept of data activism here really matters for us because it also makes us to think about the relationship of the state and social movements and civil society organizations, right? Authors like Stefania Milan, Miriam Gutierrez, Catherine D'Ignazio herself, and Lauren Klein, they think about the ways in which society proactively produce data or reacts in relation to data that is produced. So Stefania Milan, for example, has this idea of proactive and reactive data activism, right? The reactive data activism being that aims like to react to surveillance by the state. And you can think about the 2010s protests here in the US, in which the campaign Stop Watching Us against state surveillance happened, for example. In the other side, civil society, social movements, they can produce and using data when there is a situation of official data that is missing, a missing data situation. And they can do this to promote social change, to support political strategies, and to build even though new forms of collective action. And then it brings us, and soon I'll be bringing a lot of examples so it doesn't get boring with so many concepts and theory. But when we think about missing data, and this is important because uh, we are also thinking about a relational dynamic, right? A relationship in which someone, often a civil society organization, needs or demands data from a powerful actor, such as the state, but also from corporations or other dominant institutions, or actively resist them in producing data about these civil society organizations or communities. So for us, missing data refers to situations in which information is not produced or not shared, but there is this relational relationship in which someone wants the data. So missing data can therefore include data that does not exist at all, but also data that is poorly collected, like for example, data on feminicides. A lot of organizations in Latin America, the governments in which they are situated, they collect data. But this kind of data is like collected in a very poor way, or is not published very well, or is categorized it very badly. So this data, missing data can be situation in which the data is poorly maintained, poorly updated, difficult to access, deliberately removed, as I will show you some examples. In short, missing data is information that's either not produced or is produced but not shared by institutions like the state that have the power to do so. So these include data that is entirely absent, sparse or neglected, poorly collected or maintained, purposely removed, difficult to access, infrequently updated, and contested or underreported. Like for example, as occurred in the COVID-19 pandemic, like many countries were removing data, were publishing it and then removing and then putting it again, like in the case of Brazil, the data disappeared one day and the other day it was back for public scrutiny. So all these situations we understand are missing data situations. And again, I repeat myself here because this is important. It also implies a certain directionality. There is a demand. Civil society, like organized actors such as NGOs, social movements, they may turn to a state or other institutions to demand some kind of collection because this is about a problem. This is about a problem that affects them. On the other side, the state or other institutions may approach communities, which happens a lot with indigenous communities in the US, to request their data. And these may be resisted by these communities because they understand this may result in new kinds of violence. Let's think here about one example that we bring in the chapter and that I really like to talk about because it's also something I have been researching in my own dissertation. When I finished my PhD dissertation was about by Argentina and Brazil, right? And about data activism and about reproductive rights, actually. So we know there are many examples around the world about like missing data situations and this relationship of state and civil society, right? But one of them that I think is a really interesting example because you can observe this through time too, like until nowadays, these organizations are still working, is the response to dictatorships, military dictators in Latin America and South America specifically, which were, by the way, supported by the US back in the 70s, right? So in this context of dictatorship in which the civil society was repressed, there was still social movements struggling to find the lists, the names, and the data about people who were forcibly disappeared by the state. And here I talk specifically about Argentina, about Chile, about Brazil. The image here I'm referring is from Argentina, in which you can see the madres, the mothers of Plaza de Mayo, who are searching for their children, disappeared children like they were 30, 20 years old, but it were their children, right? That were disappeared by the dictatorship in Argentina. Since the 70s, civil society organizations in Argentina have pushed for a more comprehensive record of people detained and disappeared by the government. These efforts were led by groups like Clamor, as well as mothers of Plaza de Mayo, that then become grandmothers of Plaza de Mayo, searching for the grandchildren disappear also of their children. So this is also, many of you may know, one of the most important organizations in the struggle against dictatorship in Latin America and in Argentina specifically. In the 80s, at the time when public discussion was extremely dangerous and fear was like all over the country, these groups demanded that the military regime publish the list of detained and disappeared people, disclose where they were, and explain the reason of their detention. At that point in which the dictatorship was still alive, more than 12,000 people signed a petition asking specifically for this. So many years passed, but while it was also happened too, this collective action resulted in an official state list counting more than 8,000 names of disappeared people. So during this transition up for democracy in the 80s in Argentina, the Argentinian state conducted its own investigation, but it drowned its investigation in a list of 7,000 names that was made by Clamor, an organization that was then based in Brazil. And then they published it in this report you can see here in red by CONADAP. This report is still used nowadays. However, there are civil society organizations like Madres de Plaza de Mayo, Grandmothers. They consider this report incomplete. They say actually, and you can see this in this image back from the 80s, it's still nowadays is the same information they use. They say that there are actually 30,000 people disappeared by the regime. And actually, LGBTQIA plus groups, they say 400 people from these groups, LGBT people, were not in the CONADAP report. So they say there are actually 30,400 disappeared people. So while this list of 8,961 names allowed the democratic Argentinian regime to begin to process justice in collaboration with civil society, this was only possible because social movements were strongly organized. It was not only about the data, it was about the people, right? It was about their children, their colleagues, their friends, people politically disappeared. My message here is that without their sustained efforts and their demands around missing data and the missing people, the disappeared people, information about them would likely never have been made public. Consequently, the process for justice, for memory, for truth, for the victims and their families would also not have been possible. So this is one example of many others, right? There is also a situation we call of strategic neglect. This situation is when some kind of institution, like a government specifically, decides not to put resource people in data collection, in data production, and in data publication. And we can think that data production, especially in governments that in states and territories that are very large, like the US and Brazil, it takes a lot of resource. It takes a lot of time. So the governments are usually those institutions that are able to do so, right? We can think, and I'll be talking about this later, about the work of organizations working on data collection about feminicide, for example. In Brazil, it's a research group in southern Brazil that in the last 2 years, LESFEM, Laboratório de Estudos de Feminicídio, that has been collecting national data about feminicide in the country. The Brazilian government is doing this data production too, but in the Bolsonaro years, in many years, there was a lot of problems in publishing this data and making it public. So this research group has been doing it. And even now, during the moment in which we have like a compromise, a very strong compromise in collecting this data by the federal government, the production of this research group, of this small research group in southern Brazil, is bigger in terms of like the numbers that found of feminicide than the federal government. So think about it. This is what we call a strategic neglect when maybe the government makes a decision of not going deeply for those data, a specific kind of data, because it will also generate some public scrutiny, right? But given another case in point, we can consider people killed annually by the police in Brazil. In Brazil, each one of its like 26 states collect this data, but they don't necessarily make it public available. So there is in the country a freedom of information law that makes it possible for civil society organizations to like open a requisition to have access to this data. And so through this law, an initiative led by the media and by an organization called the Fórum de Segurança Pública regularly requests this information from each one of the 26 states, and then they publish the data. So thanks to this work, we know we can compare the police killings in Brazil with other countries, and you can demonstrate, like in a scale, the violence of the brutality of the Brazilian police, right? But more than that, making this data that was not public available before available to the public, we can see how racialized is this kind of violence too. So in 2021, for example, only 11 of the only no 11 of the 26 Brazilian states either didn't collect the data or choose not to share the data about the race of people killed by the police. In 2025, just to give you an update, Maranhão, a state in North Brazil, shared for the first time data on the race of people killed by the police. So based on this data, it's possible to know, like, of all the states that share this with these organizations of civil society, it's possible to know that 81% of people killed by the police in 2021 were Black. Imagine if you have from all the states in Brazil, like, right? So in this sense, neglecting the collection or the publication of data is strategic because it allows the state to maintain public security policies that are racist, that are brutal, in which killing Black people cannot be scrutinized by the public perspective, by the public vision, right? So this is what we call a strategic neglect on missing data. There is also what you call a situation of an action of counter data production. Counter data production is when like individuals or civil society, they organize to produce data about in relation to a situation of missing data. So many times it's because official data about some topic is missing or is not being made public at all, right? So as you can see, D'Ignazio, like Catherine D'Ignazio in her book Content Feminicide, she works with this concept a lot. I myself in my dissertation have been working with it. For example, in Brazil, the Rede Feminista de Saúde, a network in relation to health of women, they analyze government data and make it more accessible and easy to read in relation to abortion for the society. And from that, we can know like that more than 200,000 girls up to 14 years old, they had children in the last like 10 years. So it's just because they made this exchange like from huge data sets from the Brazilian government to making it available and readable for the whole society that we're able to talk about it nowadays in Brazil. So counter data production is the usage, but also the production itself, like anti-feminicide data activists when they produce the data and collect the data through the newspapers themselves, right? And here again, as one example among many, I have been working the project I told you about, the Data Against Feminicide project. We have found more than 190 groups around the world that produce data about feminicide facing a missing data situation to pressure the state to categorize this data well, or to start to publish or to start to collect this data in their own societies. As you can see, in the last few years, a lot of new groups emerge, and we understand like the 2015 protests in Argentina and that actually spread throughout the region in Latin America were a reason for that. The New Menos, not one woman less protest, right? In which the societies were very, very politicized, understanding gender-related killings as a major problem. This generated a lot of feminist collectives to start to collect this kind of data. So they do this because the data is missing, because they understand the government is not doing that. One example here, and you can search, is this small map in the right side, the Mexican map. This is the data production of Maria Salguero. She has this website called Yo Te Nombro, I name you, the map of feminicides in Mexico. In 1 year, she collected more than 2,000 cases in the Mexican state in terms of feminicide data. She was spending like 2 to 4 hours per day of her life, like without being paid, right? Because she wanted to, in producing data about feminicides in the country. So even though like this received a lot of media attention, right, to her work, because of course it was monumental, it was so huge, it is so huge. But a lot of other organizations also exist in the region that are doing this, including in the US. This is a map um, of organizations we have been working with in the Data Against Feminicide project, organizations we had interviewed. We have so many papers and chapters and books published about it. The main one being the Content Feminicide one, which is open access by Catherine D'Ignazio. We did like qualitative research. We don't collect data. We research those who collect and we support those who collect. So this is an example of counter data of actions of counter data production, because there is a missing data situation. In this sense, in this context, especially a missing data situation from the state, from official data, as we call. So besides the neglect and the strategic neglect we just talked about, there is also, and I'm almost finishing, there is also a situation we call the active like intention of disappear data. So these can be like data that was previously published, but that suddenly they are unpublished, they are taken down, they are deleted, made inaccessible. And this also, for us, is a political choice, right? And is more than simple neglect, right? Because it's an active and like clear political choice of disappearing data, is the strategy of erasure. Some examples here. During the COVID pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, like there was disappearance of data on infection rates, on the deaths of people related to the COVID-19, both in Brazil and the US. In this news, you can read Bolsonaro government imposed a blackout on COVID-19 data in Brazil amid a surge in that. So the deaths were raising, the government decided to remove the data from public scrutiny. Same happened in the US. So this is a strategic choice of missing data. It's a missing data situation through a strategic choice, right? Same thing happened with the environmental protection agents in the US during the first Trump term, in which like data from these agents was disappearing. What generate, and that's the interesting part, a response from people who care about this data. So they created, some scientists and activists, this initiative called Data Refugee, which like in which they came together to download and save the data before the EPA data was disappeared from official websites. And so, according to these activists and scientists, these initiatives they help to deter to like stop the administration, the U.S. administration, to delete more data, because indeed the data stopped to be deleted at all. There was still some data in the official websites. A similar process happened in Argentina back in 2024 and until nowadays, honestly. As you know, or maybe you don't, Argentina has nowadays as a president Javier Milei, which is an ultra-conservative, like right-wing president. And when he came to power, one of the first things he has done was to remove it all, like to disappear with the Minister of Women, Gender, and Diversities. But besides that, besides political like dismantling this ministry, he also disappeared with the website and all the information that was public available. Feminists were very quick, and they started immediately to save this all this information in a drive that later was embraced by Claxo, which is a scientific social science foundation from Latin America. And nowadays, this data is saved in a Claxo repository. So it's there. You can still access information about women, about abortion. I was researching at that point. I was finishing my dissertation and I didn't have more access to the reports I was studying. Gladly, I had downloaded myself some of the reports, and gladly, like these reports and information are already saved in Claxo. But these indeed happened in Argentina too. There was this active disappearance. And finally, and I'm almost finished, I promise, I'm talking for half an hour. I also need to point out the paradox of exposure that Ignacio and Klein actually they talk about it in her book, right? But this is idea that while yes, being counted and being in data sets, maybe it brings benefits, because then like structural violence is visible. For example, racist violence is visible when you can see the data in scale. Also, in the other side, we are more visible in data sets when we are counted. And for marginalized communities, this may be a problem for queer communities, for Black communities. Ruha Benjamin, for example, in her book, A Race After Technology, starts the book with this example about uh, uh, police violence and race is scrutiny, like data on race of some neighborhoods and how the police would be in neighborhoods with more Black people. So more data may generate more violence too. There are risks. In the US, for example, you can see this news that's very recent from December 2025. There are some information that the state has been, law enforcement has been using social media, like scrapping, to see which people are more like prone to be criminals, and this is related to race and to being queer. So here again, data missing, protecting our data, making the state have a situation of missing data may be a protection strategy, as in the case of indigenous communities, for example. So marginalized groups can actively produce missing data to protect themselves of this over surveillance I was talking about, prevalent weaponized database and state violence. I do recommend, if you are interested in this discussion, you go to this chapter. Also in the same book, the missing data piece is published about indigenous data sovereignty by Russo, Duarte, and Liborion, in which like they bring many examples on how indigenous communities they protect their own data and how they understand their data sovereignty in relation to the state that's usually actually the source of violence for indigenous communities, right? Not only in the US or in Canada, but also in the whole Latin America. So just to finish, I do want to call attention to the idea that data alone is never, never enough. Data alone is never enough. Like the Ignacio makes it very clear in her book, like all the interviews we conducted with all the organizations in Latin America and around the world that are collecting data about feminicide, they always made it very clear. They are collecting the data, they are producing, they are in an action of counter data production for a reason, because they want justice, they want memory, they want eradicate feminicide for all those women killed by their partners, ex-partners, or even strange people. So the counter data production is part of a bigger plot, let's say, in this way. So it's part of a process of a struggle for justice for these organizations, right? And just to kind of give a full circle here, we can think again about the grandmothers of Plaza de Mayo and the mothers of Plaza de Mayo. Their struggles are actually ongoing. Like if you go to their website, Abuelas de Plaza de Mayo, grandmothers of Plaza de Mayo, they are still in the search for their disappeared children, grandchildren, right? Like their children had children where they were disappeared, and most of them were killed afterwards, but the dictatorship like still stole like their grandchildren and gave to other families. They are still in the search for these grandchildren, and many children were actually already found. So this is much more than the data itself. But the counterproduction, the data counterproduction, the counter data production, I'm sorry, and the struggles for having those lists published are also part of it, are important part, but are part of this big context of continuity in the struggle. So the data itself won't do anything alone. But with the struggles, we can like build and organize ourselves. It indeed can, as this case shows. And just to finish with some like resources, all these three resources are open access. The Catherine's book, Content Feminicide, a book I just published last year called Feminist Security Studies from Latin America and the Caribbean, which is in Spanish actually. It's about data activism, counter data production, but also about other problems in relation to feminicide in Latin America and the Caribbean. And this report that was just published in English, in Spanish, and in Portuguese called Data Activism Against Feminicide. Isadora Cruxen and I, we present the 5 years of the project Data Against Feminicide in this project. So I invite you to read and share. That's it. And I stay open to hear from you. Like, it would be great, like, to hear examples of missing data situations you see in your daily life, in what you work with, and so on. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This was so interesting. Yeah, feel free to put questions in the chat, in the Q&A. You can raise your hand if you want to talk. I'll start with a question while you all think about them. I was thinking when you all, Alessandra, were talking about how many of these efforts about feminicide, but also about, I'm from Argentina, so obviously the madres and abuelas. It's something that I've grown up knowing. I was born a few years after that. So many are led by women and so many are led by mothers. And I was wondering if you, in your research, has ever encountered the idea of this kind of work as care work. And that might be the reason why mothers and grandmothers, women in general, we're more conditioned to maybe do that.
Yeah, That's part of I mean, it's part of our research. We have like this small article. Catherine Elena Suarez de Val and Angeles wrote like 3 or 4 years ago about care work in the data collection of feminicide process, right? Because indeed it is related like to some kind a structural pattern in one sense, like we women, we you carry the burden and sometimes it's not only a burden, but most of the times it is of doing most of the care work, right? In one sense. And it I think it's strategic how the madres and abuelas and other organizations, like in Mexico, Madres Buscadoras, for example, they use this stereotype in their favor. So there is a very interesting strategy going on here too. Is to say, yes, we are the mothers, we are the grandmothers, and we're searching for our children. And for, in one sense, it generates more legitimacy, right? And a place to speak from and to call from justice. So there is, I mean, there are many relationships here. One is the caring for the others, the caring for the children. The other is caring for the data and caring for ourselves while collecting the data too. Because this process, for example, of collecting data about feminicide is such a difficult kind of work. Imagine being 2, 3 hours per day looking at violence, reading newspapers, reading news and newspapers in relation to this kind of violence. We're talking about killings, right? You are in the end, you are very, very sad. So, like having strategies to care for each other and for oneself is also part of the process. And this is in that piece I just told you, and it's called care and emotional work in the data collection of data in relation to feminicide. You can search it online. I think you will find it.
Great, thank you. Any other questions, either in the chat or if you want to like ask Alessandra directly, you can just unmute yourself and ask it. Just remember, we're being nice and we're being polite. And but yeah, if you have any more questions for Alessandra, um, this is the time. I like to say that you dazzle them.
What? Sorry.
You dazzle them. I see some hearts coming up. Well, you think, so I have recorded the session and I will be sharing the link with everyone. And Alessandra, would be you be okay with sharing your slides with me and I share them with the
Of
people who
course.
attended? Perfect.
Yes.
So you're gonna have the slides as well. And I do recommend reading the missing data chapter. I read it when I found about Alessandra. So it's a really good chapter. I just in general, all the chapters on that book are quite really, really good and really interesting things to think about when it comes to data. I don't think we have any questions. So if that's the case, thank you so much oh yes, thank you so much um for speaking to us this morning, for taking the time, for sharing your research. I think all of us are very, very interested. And I can't wait to see what other books you come up with because this is right up my alley. Uh, so again, thank you so much. And I'll be in touch with everyone with the recording and the slides. Have a great rest of your day. Have a great rest of your week. And I'll see you all hopefully very soon.
Thank you so much.